Welcome back to Malaysia's ASEAN Moment, a limited series on the 2025 ASEAN Chairmanship diving into Malaysia's approach and priorities from a policy perspective. I'm your host, Angeline, and I'm joined by Associate Professor Ngeow. Dr. Ngeow is the director of the Institute of China Studies at the University of Malaya and also a non-resident scholar at Carnegie, China. I would describe him as Malaysia's leading expert on Chinese politics and China's relationship with Malaysia and Southeast Asia today. Dr. Ngeow, we're very grateful to have you today. So one of the key flashpoints in this region is the South China Sea. It's a vast body of water, rich in natural resources, and home to one of the world's most important shipping lanes. This makes freedom of navigation not just a regional priority, but a global one. And the South China Sea is also at the center of overlapping territorial claims between China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, and also Malaysia. In recent years, tensions have escalated, particularly as China has increased its gray zone tactics, while external powers like the US, Australia, and the EU have also expanded their presence in the region. Now, since 2002, ASEAN has led efforts to negotiate a COC, or a Code of Conduct, with China, which aims to provide a framework to manage the maritime disputes. However, it's been over 20 years, and progress has been slow, and I would say that a conclusion seems quite distant. Now, this is just a very, very quick snapshot because the South China Sea is a deeply, deeply complex issue with many overlapping and many very different perspectives. So in today's episode, we aim to break it down from a Malaysian point of view, and this is where Dr. Ngeow comes in. So as a starting question, let's start with Malaysia's approach. Could you give us an idea of how Malaysia handles this bilaterally and multilaterally in the South China Sea?
A very good morning to you, Angeline. I'm glad to be here and honored to be here. So about the questions of the South China Sea and how Malaysia is handling the dispute and issue. And in terms of bilateral, of course, actually, we also have overlapping claims with other neighboring countries, including Vietnam and the Philippines. But I think the most important bilateral engagement power that we're dealing with today is China. Malaysia's approach generally is described as low profile or moderate or de-escalatory, and I think all these terms generally convey certain sense of how Malaysia wants to deal with the issue, in the sense that we will be firm in terms of protecting the legitimate rights and claims of Malaysia in accordance with the international law, but otherwise we won't seek to escalate any kind of tensions. In that sense, we are much more reactory, in the sense that we only will voice up when there is a certain perceived infringement of our rights. Otherwise, we will maintain a rather moderate approach when it comes to handling the dispute, in this case, the bilateral dispute with China. Multilaterally, Malaysia is committed to the COC process, and as you mentioned just now, the COC has been about 20 years already. Still, I think Malaysia will still look at this as the only viable option. Whether future there will be others, that remain to be seen, but as long as this is the case, Malaysia will still very much commit to a ASEAN multilateral platform together with China to come up with a more durable regional maritime order in the South China Sea.
Oh, that's a very loaded answer. Let's start picking it apart a little bit, if you don't mind. On the bilateral approach, because you say that we have a more low-profile, more moderate approach bilaterally, some countries have described this as not being vocal enough in supporting some of our ASEAN members' struggles in the South China Sea. How would you explain it from a Malaysian point of view? Are we not doing enough?
Well, I think we understand how some of our neighboring countries and friends look at Malaysia's stance, but of course, Malaysia also had its own interests and calculations to look after. Malaysia, of course, to a certain extent, sympathize and supports some of our neighboring countries' struggle for securing their own interests, but we don't necessarily feel that our approach or our way of handling the disputes should be changed because of how others are doing things. As of the moment, Malaysia's approach to the South China Sea on the bilateral front, I don't think there is any incentive for Malaysia government to move either stronger or any weaker. We have secured what we believe are our legitimate rights and interests. We have handled the issue in a way that is more stable rather than destabilizing. And we don't think that we have to do anything more or less in that sense.
I think that's the key, right? That our approach is prioritizing a stable environment and not to destabilize or allow any escalation to happen in the South China Sea. Um, Having said that, I also think that it seems I share this point of view, and I think maybe you do as well, that our response in the South China Sea is very appropriate. It's very appropriate in response to our situation in the South China Sea. China has not been as provocative in our waters as it has in some of the other claimant states.
Well, let me just put it this way. How each country wants to deal with this issue, of course, is the best decision is for them to make. Sometimes it is not entirely correct that is to say that we are not vocal. We will be vocal when it is necessary. So I think there are many cases that in the past you can see that when the Chinese Air Forces coming close to our airspace, we will voice out. And when there were issues that we feel that is actually impinging on our national interests, we will voice out. But our approach is that we don't want to maintain at a very high level of vocal opposition to China all the time. That is not necessary. So we will only react and be vocal when it is necessary, and then China will get the message, and then we will let the diplomacy take over. And then if things go back to the normal stage, then we should stay at the normal stage, being moderate and being de-escalatory, but at the same time being firm in protecting our rights. So I think that is basically how Malaysia look into this issue. How other countries believe that how they should protect their own interests, of course, is up for them to decide.
So, would you say then that Malaysia's approach to the South China Sea, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, would you say it complement ASEAN's overall processes?
To a certain extent, I would say yes. It's very much ASEAN centric to a certain extent, but also based on bilateral and based on our own national interests and considerations as well. And I think Malaysia, together with other ASEAN member states, we have come up with statements to highlight how important it is to preserve regional peace and stability, to prevent escalations. And I think all these points are basically messages that are sent to help support our neighbor, our friend, the Philippines.
All right. Well, moving on to the COC negotiations, I feel that when we talk about the COC, there's too much focus on China because, as you mentioned earlier, Malaysia actually has issues with our own ASEAN member countries as well. We have issues with Vietnam. We have issues with Philippines. Do you think that the COC, it's not just about China is not the only problem with the COC?
I would agree. I think each country has their own sets of things that they are looking after, and sometimes these elements are not necessarily widely agreeable or shared by other countries. Vietnam definitely had its own set of things that they want to secure. Same with Philippines and same with Malaysia. Therefore, the problem with the COC, and sometimes it is really not surprising that it has taken such a long time because you need each and every one. And for just one country to disagree, one veto, that is going to prolong the negotiation. So not to mention the wide gap between China and the Philippines on this particular issue in terms of just about the geographical scope of application of the COC. There is already a big enough gap for China and the Philippines. More so Vietnam and more so Malaysia, we also have things that we want to inject into the COC but may not necessarily always be agreeable to other countries.
Now, what about the geopolitical context? As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of external powers, like the US, for example, that has been increasingly interested in this region, particularly with the South China Sea. What is Malaysia's perspective of these external actors?
Malaysia, of course, again, welcome external partners to play constructive role. And one of those constructive roles, I believe, will be actually to encourage more common grounds and conciliation among the different parties in this particular dispute. And sometimes I do feel that there is over-exaggeration or the tendency to try to exploit the differences between on the one hand China and on the other hand all these other countries for geopolitical reasons. But I don't think that is actually a good way. Of course, the differences between China and Southeast Asian claimant states are very clear. They have different understanding. Each Southeast Asian claimant country also have their own different understanding. But the point here is actually trying to find certain common grounds, certain way to pragmatically cooperate and manage the issue. And I think these external partners should actually encourage this trend, rather than always try to portray the dispute as being one of China overpowering all the other countries and all the other countries now being suppressed or being under the Chinese hegemonic power.
My final question for you will be about the chairmanship. So, as we know, we are the ASEAN chair this year, and some people may not know, we're also the country coordinator for China and ASEAN for the next few years. What do you think the expectations are for Malaysia in handling the South China Sea issue? Are these realistic expectations, and what are we actually capable of delivering?
I think on our own, what we can do, in particular being the country coordinator with China, we can definitely increase the frequency and the intensity of the COC negotiations, and being the country that handle this kind of negotiations and meetings, we have certain ways to set the agenda and move it towards certain directions that will be more conducive towards finding final solution. However, this is the subjective view. This is what we can do, but there is also the objective realities. Sometimes is that no matter how much subjectively Malaysia is willing to invest and willing to increase the commitment and so on and so forth, sometimes it may not be enough to overcome the objective realities out there. And the objective realities is something that we already kind of touched upon. You just need one country to say no to a particular elements of the COC for the entire things to go to unravel. So it's very difficult to find really unanimous agreements of almost all elements, all these contentious elements in the South China Sea.
All right, well, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you, Dr. Ngeow, for sharing your insights with us. You've been listening to Malaysia's ASEAN Moment, an ISIS Malaysia podcast. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, X, and LinkedIn at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, ISIS Malaysia, for more updates and insights into our chairmanship year.